There's a recording that certain people in certain offices have been trying to locate for over 2 decades, and the man who made it died before anyone could stop him. His name was David Mercer. He was a government geologist, one of the most decorated field researchers his agency had ever employed. He had spent 30 years going to places most people cannot find on a map, drilling into rock, measuring pressure gradients, writing reports that went up the chain and came back stamped with approval. He was not a rebel. He was not a whistleblower type. He was the kind of man who wore the same brand of boots for 20 years because they worked, who kept his files in order, who believed in the system he served. And then something happened to him out in the field, something that the system he served decided it could not afford to acknowledge. And in the last weeks of his life, lying in a bed in a house that smelled of old wood and cold air coming through a window he refused to close, David Mercer did something very deliberate. He called two people he trusted, not family, not former colleagues. Two specific individuals he had spent years quietly identifying as people who would understand what he was about to say. He sat up in that bed, he pressed record on a small device on the nightstand, and he talked. He talked for a long time. When those two people left the house that evening, each of them carried a copy of what he had said. Within 18 months of David Mercer's death, both copies had disappeared, and the people who came looking for them were not journalists. They were not historians. The people who came looking moved quietly, showed credentials that made other people step back, and left without answering questions. That is where this story begins. Not with the discovery, not with the expedition, with the recording that someone needed badly enough to go find, and with the question of what a dying man said into a small device on a nightstand that made it worth finding at all. If any of what I just told you made the hairs on your arms stand up, you are going to want to stay with this. Friends, please subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need to hear it. Now, to understand why that recording mattered, you need to understand who David Mercer actually was, because that part is the part that makes everything else impossible to dismiss. Mercer grew up in a household where public service was not a career choice. It was an expectation. His grandfather had worked in federal land survey. His father had spent a career in environmental policy. The family did not produce dreamers or idealists in the loud sense. They produced people who showed up, did the work, filed the paperwork correctly, and believed that institutions, however imperfect, were the best available tool for managing the truth responsibly. David inherited all of that. He studied geology at a state university, graduated near the top of his class, and was recruited directly into a government research division that specialized in extreme environment fieldwork. Over the following 3 decades, he led expeditions to volcanic regions, deep Arctic terrain, high-altitude mineral survey sites. He received commendations. He briefed congressional subcommittees. His name appeared in the acknowledgement sections of peer-reviewed papers written by people far more famous than him, because that was the role he preferred, the man behind the credible data, the name you cite when you need the finding to hold up. He was not the kind of person who invented things. He was not the kind of person who exaggerated. His colleagues, the ones who spoke about him after his death, used the same word over and over without coordinating with each other. They called him careful. And here is the thing about careful people. When a careful person tells you something that sounds impossible, the discomfort you feel is not because they are wrong. It is because they are right, and you are not ready for it. Mercer spent 30 years being careful, and then he found something that careful documentation could not protect, because the system he had always trusted looked at what he brought back and decided that careful documentation was exactly the problem. The expedition Mercer led was supposed to last 8 months. It lasted 6 weeks. And when the team came home, every single member was placed under a travel restriction that nobody talked about publicly. Here is what the official record says about that mission. It was a polar environmental survey, a routine assessment of subsurface geological activity in a remote region that most people could not point to on a map without help. The agency released a short statement describing the goals: baseline measurements, ice core sampling, thermal mapping of the upper crust, standard language, the kind of language designed to make your eyes slide right past it without catching on anything. Now here is what the actual mission looked like on the ground. The team that assembled at the staging point 2 weeks before departure was not a geology crew. I mean, yes, there were geologists on it, Mercer included, but there were also people whose professional backgrounds nobody explained clearly. Logistics specialists who knew things about secure communication equipment that no environmental survey has any use for. Two individuals whose role was listed as technical support, but who spent the pre-departure briefings asking questions about structural load tolerances and subterranean pressure dynamics. And the equipment. The equipment list that Mercer kept a copy of, the copy that later vanished from his files, along with everything else, described drilling apparatus and acoustic resonance sensors of a kind that are typically used not to study the surface of something, but to map what is underneath it at serious depth. This was not a team sent to look at ice. This was a team sent to find out what the ice was sitting on top of. They flew in on a transport that smelled of engine oil and cold metal, the kind of cold that gets into your sinuses and stays there. The base camp was already partially established when they arrived, which itself was strange, because Mercer had been told they were the first team in. Someone had been there before them. The boot prints in the compacted snow around the equipment depot were old enough to have glazed over, but recent enough to still hold their shape. Nobody explained them. Nobody was asked to explain them, and the mission began. For the first 3 weeks, everything proceeded according to the stated plan. Drilling, sampling, measurements logged and transmitted back to the agency in daily reports. And then, in the 4th week, the acoustic sensors hit something. Not rock, not ice. Something with a geometry that natural geology does not produce. Angles, regularity. The kind of subsurface signature that, when Mercer looked at the readout, made him sit very still for a long time in a tent that crackled in the wind, staring at numbers that his 30 years of experience told him were not possible. He checked the equipment. He ran the calibration sequence twice. He got the same result both times. And then he did what a careful man does. He documented it. He photographed the readout. He wrote it into the official log in precise technical language that could not be misread. Within 48 hours of that log entry, the mission director received a communication from the agency. The details of that communication were not shared with the team. What was shared was the decision it produced. The mission was ending. Weather conditions, they were told. Logistical constraints. The polar season was shifting faster than projected. Everyone was to pack, secure the equipment, and prepare for extraction within 72 hours. Mercer pushed back. He asked, calmly and in writing, for an explanation consistent with the meteorological data he had been looking at every morning, data that showed nothing unusual. He received no response to that written request. What he received instead was a quiet conversation with the mission director outside the main tent. In air so cold, it turned every word into a small cloud of vapor, in which he was told, without any particular hostility, that the decision had been made above both of them and that the professional thing to do was to move on. They flew home. And 3 days after landing, the travel restriction landed in Mercer's inbox like a stone dropped into still water. He was not the only one who noticed the acoustic data, but he was the only one who kept a copy of the readout. And he was the only one who, instead of moving on as instructed, spent the next several months asking a very quiet, very persistent question. He did not ask what was down there. He already had a theory about that. What he asked was something more specific, and in some ways more unsettling. He asked who else had already known. That question led him somewhere nobody in the agency expected him to go. It led him backward, into a paper trail so old that parts of it had never been digitized, sitting in archive boxes in facilities that technically fell under his agency's jurisdiction, but that nobody had physically visited in years. And what he found in those boxes did not answer his question. It made it infinitely larger. Because it turned out that the acoustic signature his sensors had picked up in that frozen ground had been partially documented before. Not recently, not by his agency, by a man working alone, in a different era, using instruments that should not have been sensitive enough to detect anything at all. A man whose report had been filed, stamped, and placed in a box that nobody was supposed to open. The report had a date on it that stopped Mercer cold when he read it. And next to the date, in handwriting that had faded to the color of old tea, was a single sentence that he later described as the moment the floor disappeared beneath him. The sentence read, "This formation does not belong to any natural process I have studied. It was made." So Mercer did what any careful man would do when he finds something that important buried in a box that was not supposed to be opened. He wrote it up. He documented everything. He compiled his acoustic data, the archived report, and a detailed analysis connecting the two, and he submitted it through the proper internal channel with a cover note requesting a formal review. The response came back in 4 days. The submission had been received. The matter had been reviewed at the appropriate level. No further investigation was warranted. The acoustic anomaly was consistent with known geological formations in the region, and the archived report he had referenced contained measurement errors that had been identified and addressed at the time of its original filing. Case closed. Move on. Mercer sat with that response for a long time. He printed it out and held it in his hands the way you hold something you are trying to decide whether to throw away or keep. He kept it. He kept everything. And then he did something that no one in the agency anticipated from a man with his record and his temperament. He went to the press, not a major outlet. A small independent publication that covered environmental and scientific policy, the kind of publication that serious people in serious institutions tend to dismiss as background noise. He did not give them everything. He was careful even then. He gave them enough. He described the expedition, the premature termination, the acoustic data, the archived report, the dismissal. He was measured. He was precise. He used language that any working scientist would recognize as legitimate. The article ran. It was small. It did not trend. It did not produce a wave of follow-up coverage. But within 3 weeks of its publication, something happened that was wildly disproportionate to the size of that article. 3 separate government agencies quietly expanded their classification authority over all data collected during the expedition. Every log, every measurement, every photograph taken during those 6 weeks was pulled from the internal system and reclassified at a level that put it beyond Mercer's own access. His access. To data he had personally collected. That is not a bureaucratic housekeeping exercise. That is a response. And responses that size do not happen because someone published a small article in a publication that nobody reads. They happen because the people reading it knew exactly what the careful, precise, measured language in that article was pointing at. And they knew that if anyone else with the right background read it the same way, the next question would not be about one anomalous expedition in one remote location. The next question would be about all of them. The documents Mercer found next were so old that the paper they were printed on had turned the color of skin, and what they showed should have rewritten every geography textbook ever published. After the reclassification of his expedition data, Mercer did not stop. If anything, the institutional silence pushed him harder in a direction that nobody anticipated. He started pulling historical records, not recent ones, old ones. The kind that live in physical archives in buildings that smell of dust and slow decay, where the filing systems were designed by people who have been dead for generations, and where nobody comes looking anymore because everything important, everyone assumes, has already been digitized and cross-referenced and made accessible. That assumption is exactly what Mercer was counting on. What he found, buried in 3 separate archive collections that were technically connected to his agency's historical predecessor organizations, was a series of cartographic documents, maps, very old maps, produced by different hands in different eras, held in different collections on different continents, that had somehow never been formally compared to each other. And when Mercer laid them out side by side, photographing each one carefully in the pale yellow light of an archive reading room that hummed with the sound of climate control equipment, what he saw made his hands go still on the table. Each map depicted the same region his expedition had surveyed. Each one showed, in varying degrees of detail, a geographic feature that modern survey data confirmed was real. A subsurface structure, a formation of a specific shape and scale, sitting beneath the frozen ground of that remote polar region. The maps were not identical. They had been produced independently by people who had no documented contact with each other, separated by generations. But they were describing the same thing, and the oldest of them, the one that made Mercer sit back in his chair and stare at the ceiling for a long time, predated any modern exploration of that region by an enormous margin. Nobody should have known that formation was there. Nobody should have been able to map it. The technology to detect subsurface geometry at that depth did not exist when that map was made. It barely existed when Mercer's own acoustic sensors picked it up on that frozen field. So who drew it? That was the question that settled into Mercer like cold water finding a crack in stone. Not what is it? Not how big is it? Who drew it? When? And from what source did they get their information? Because a map is not a guess. A map is a record of something someone observed. And whoever observed that formation and committed it to paper in that archived document had access to knowledge that, by every official account of human history, they could not possibly have had. Mercer cross-referenced the maps against every publicly available academic study of the region he could find. He found 3 papers, published across different decades by researchers who appeared to have worked independently of each other, that each touched briefly on cartographic anomalies in the same area before pivoting to other conclusions. Each paper was thorough in every other respect, but on that specific point, each one moved past it quickly, as if the author had noticed something uncomfortable in their peripheral vision and chosen not to turn their head toward it. Mercer contacted 2 of the surviving authors. One did not respond. The other responded once, briefly, to say that the cartographic question had been outside the scope of his research and that he had no further comment. The email had the careful, slightly too neutral tone of a man who had been advised to say very little. The maps were real. They were verifiable. They were sitting in archive collections that anyone with the right institutional access could physically visit and examine. They could not be explained away. And what they pointed toward, when you followed the logic without flinching, was a conclusion so large and so disruptive that Mercer understood immediately why 3 separate agencies had moved to reclassify his expedition data the moment he described the acoustic anomaly in print. Because the acoustic anomaly and the maps were the same story. And the story was this: someone had been to that place before. Someone had mapped what was underneath it. And that someone existed at a point in time when, according to everything we are taught about human history, no civilization with that capability was supposed to exist. That realization did not make Mercer feel excited. It made him feel the specific unease of a man who has just understood that the solid ground he has been standing on his entire professional life is, in fact, a ceiling. The maps were the pivot point, but they were not the most disturbing thing he found. The most disturbing thing came next, when he started asking not just who had made the maps, but where they had gotten their source data. Because maps do not come from nowhere. Every cartographic document is a copy, a translation, a reduction of something earlier. Someone drew those maps from something, and that something led Mercer to a name that kept appearing quietly and consistently at the edges of documents that had nothing obvious in common with each other. Not a person's name, a place, a civilization, one that had been described in detailed geographic and administrative terms across centuries of documented sources, and that had then been removed from the official historical record so thoroughly that most educated people today have never heard of it. And the regions it had occupied, the territories it had administered, the access points its own documents described as leading downward rather than outward, corresponded with a precision that felt almost aggressive to the exact areas that Mercer's maps were depicting beneath the ice. He spent 3 weeks building that connection on paper, cross-referencing sources, checking translations, looking for the error that would make it fall apart. He did not find an error. What he found instead was that the erasure of this civilization from the historical record had not been gradual or accidental. It had been systematic, and it had happened fast. Within the span of roughly 2 generations, every major institutional record keeper in the regions concerned had stopped using the name, stopped referencing the territories, stopped acknowledging the infrastructure. Like a word that everyone agrees simultaneously to stop saying. The ruins, though, did not disappear. They could not be reclassified or archived. They were physical. They were in the ground. And the people who encountered them over the following centuries kept writing them down, kept describing them in terms that did not match anything in the official record of the region, kept noting the scale and the geometry and the obvious deliberateness of the construction. And every single one of those accounts ended the same way, with silence, with a filing away, with a moving on that felt, when you read the documents in sequence, less like a natural conclusion and more like a door being quietly pulled shut from the other side. Mercer understood now that he was not looking at one suppressed discovery. He was looking at a pattern that ran across centuries, across institutions, across borders. A single, consistent reflex. Find it, document it, make it disappear. And the question that kept him awake in the weeks that followed, sitting at his kitchen table with papers spread out under a lamp that buzzed faintly in the quiet of the house, was not whether this pattern was real. He had already proven it was real. The question was how deep it went, and whether anyone had ever gotten close enough to the center of it to understand who, exactly, had been maintaining it for so long. Every single researcher who had gotten close to this pattern before Mercer had stopped, not because they lost interest, because something made them stop. And Mercer was about to find out exactly what that something was. The pattern he had identified across the historical record was not subtle once you knew what to look for. It had a shape, a sequence, Someone finds evidence of the underground civilization, documents it carefully, submits or publishes the findings, and then the findings go quiet, filed away, reclassified. Dismissed without engagement. Mercer had assumed, up to this point, that the people doing the filing and the dismissing were faceless institutional processes, bureaucratic gravity pulling inconvenient information downward. But as he dug further into the individual cases, reading the personal correspondence of researchers who had encountered this material in previous generations, a different picture started forming. In several cases, the researcher had not just been ignored. They had been visited, not threatened, not pressured in any obvious way, simply visited by someone who showed credentials, asked precise and knowledgeable questions about the specific findings, and left. And in each case, within a short time after that visit, the researcher had quietly redirected their focus, changed projects, taken positions at institutions that moved them away from the relevant work. Not forced out, redirected. The difference matters, because forced removal leaves traces, creates grievances, produces people who talk. Redirection leaves nothing, just a researcher who, for reasons that always sounded reasonable on the surface, simply moved on. Mercer documented 12 separate cases that fit this pattern across different countries and different decades. The credentials shown during those visits were never from the same institution twice, but the questions asked were always from the same framework, the same specific vocabulary, the same precise understanding of what the researcher had found and why it mattered. That consistency across different institutional identities pointed towards something that was not any single government agency, something older, something that did not need a building or a budget line to operate, because it had been operating long enough to have developed its own momentum, its own institutional memory, its own quiet understanding of what needed to be managed and how. Mercer sat with that realization in his kitchen at 2 in the morning, the lamp buzzing, the papers spread out in front of him, and felt something he later described to one of the two people he trusted as the specific sensation of understanding that you have been inside a system your entire career without ever seeing the system clearly. Like spending 30 years in a room and only now noticing the shape of the walls. He kept going. Because that is what careful people do. The science that Mercer turned to next did not come from archives or historical documents. It came from peer-reviewed journals, the most mainstream and verifiable category of evidence available. And what it confirmed was more unsettling than anything he had found in the old files, precisely because it was not hidden. It was published. It was accessible. It had been sitting in the open the entire time. And the reason most people had never connected it to everything else was simply that nobody had thought to look at it alongside everything else. Mainstream geological research had, over the preceding decades, confirmed the existence of something extraordinary beneath the frozen surface of the polar region Mercer had surveyed. Not one underground space, a network of them, liquid water bodies sealed beneath enormous pressure, existing in total darkness, completely isolated from the surface world for what the researchers estimated were enormous spans of time. The isolation was the key word. These spaces had not been touched by anything from the surface. Whatever was in them had been in them, unchanged, for longer than most people are comfortable thinking about. The research papers described the thermal conditions in those spaces with clinical precision, geothermal gradients maintaining liquid water, chemical compositions suggesting biological activity, connected drainage channels linking separate bodies of water into a system that functioned, the researchers noted with careful academic language, with a coherence that suggested something more organized than random geological process. They did not elaborate on that observation. They noted it and moved past it, the way the cartographic researchers had moved past the map anomalies. The way everyone who got close to this material seemed to develop the same reflex of not quite looking directly at the thing they had found. But Mercer looked directly at it. He read those papers and he mapped their findings against his acoustic data from the expedition, against the subsurface geometry his sensors had detected, against the shape of the formation that the old cartographic documents had depicted. And the overlay was not approximate. It was exact. The network that peer-reviewed science had confirmed existed beneath the ice connected, at specific points, to the formation that his expedition had been sent to find, and that 3 agencies had immediately moved to reclassify when he described it in print. The subterranean network was real, confirmed by science that nobody could credibly dispute. The formation his sensors had found was real. The maps that had depicted it centuries before modern technology could detect it were real. And now, connecting them was a body of mainstream research that had been published in open journals and read by thousands of scientists who had simply never had a reason to put it next to everything else. The pieces had been sitting in plain sight in separate rooms. Mercer was the first person, as far as he could determine, to carry them into the same room and lay them on the same table. What that picture showed, when all the pieces were together, was not a geological curiosity. It was an environment, a specific, thermally stable, spatially extensive, isolated environment that had existed in that state for an enormous amount of time. An environment that, if you removed every assumption about what was supposed to be possible and just looked at the physical conditions, was entirely capable of sustaining complex structures, complex systems. Something that had gone down there a very long time ago and had the conditions necessary to stay. Mercer wrote all of this up, not for publication this time, not for an internal submission. He wrote it for himself, in a document that he kept on a drive that never connected to any network, printed once, and stored in a place that was not his office and not his home. He was careful. He had always been careful, but now the carefulness had a different quality to it. It was not the carefulness of a professional protecting his methodology. It was the carefulness of a man who had understood, finally and completely, that the 12 researchers before him had not simply moved on by choice, and that the people who had redirected them knew exactly what they had found, which meant they also knew about the network, about the formation, about all of it, and had known for a very long time. The question burning in Mercer's mind now was not what is down there. The question was, what had those people decided to do about it? Mercer knew exactly what happened to the researchers who got too close. He had documented 12 of them, and he chose to keep going anyway. That decision, the moment he made it, changed the texture of everything he did afterward. The carefulness was still there, but underneath it now was something else. A deliberate quality. The way a man moves when he knows he is being watched and has decided that being watched is no longer a reason to stop. He had spent months building a picture that connected his expedition, the acoustic data, the ancient maps, the erased civilization, and the confirmed subterranean network into a single coherent argument. And he had reached the point where keeping that argument to himself felt more dangerous than sharing it. Not dangerous to him personally, dangerous in the way that a truth kept in one place is always in danger of disappearing with the person holding it. So he did what he had been thinking about for a long time. He identified two people, not colleagues, not journalists. Two specific individuals he had spent years quietly watching from a distance, people whose work and backgrounds told him they would understand the full weight of what he was about to hand them. The first was a man named James Calloway, who ran a small independent research institution focused on historical geographic anomalies. Not a fringe operation, a serious, methodical organization with connections to several university archive systems and a track record of producing work that mainstream academics quietly cited without attribution. Calloway had spent years building a research framework around the same erased civilization that Mercer had traced through the cartographic documents. He had gotten close to the connection between that civilization and the polar region. But he had never had the acoustic data. He had never had the expedition records. He had been working in the dark with half the picture. The second person was a woman named Sarah Okafor, who held a position in an archival research division of an institution with access to pre-modern documents that most researchers never get near. She had spent her career cataloging and cross-referencing historical geographic records, and in a paper she had published years earlier, she had noted, in a single careful sentence buried in a footnote, that certain cartographic documents in her institution's collection depicted subsurface features of the polar region that corresponded with no known geological survey. She had not followed that sentence. She had left it there, in a footnote, and moved on. But the fact that she had written it at all told Mercer that she had seen what he had seen and had understood it and had made a choice about how far to go with it. He wanted to know if that choice was still open. He contacted both of them separately, not by email, not by phone, in person through channels that required physical effort to trace, which was the point. He met Calloway first, in a reading room of a regional archive that neither of them was affiliated with, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the faint sound of a heating system working against the cold outside. He laid out the full picture, all of it. The expedition, the acoustic data, the reclassification, the old maps, the erased civilization, the subterranean network, the pattern of suppression across 12 documented cases. He talked for a long time. Calloway sat across from him and did not interrupt once. When Mercer finished, Calloway was quiet for a moment, and then he said very calmly that he had been waiting for someone to bring him the other half of this for years. The meeting with Sarah Okafor happened 2 weeks later. She was more guarded than Calloway, which Mercer had expected. She asked precise questions. She challenged specific pieces of the evidence. She pushed back on two of his source attributions in ways that were entirely correct and that he had to acknowledge. And then, at the end of a conversation that had stretched well past the point where the archive reading room had emptied out around them, she pulled her own folder from her bag and placed it on the table. Inside it were photographs of the cartographic documents she had referenced in that footnote years earlier, documents she had never published in full. Documents that showed, in a detail that made Mercer's breath catch slightly, a feature of the polar region that matched his acoustic data with a precision that felt almost like someone had designed it to be found exactly this way. He drove home from that meeting in the dark, the heater in his car running and the road ahead lit in a narrow cone of headlights, and felt something he had not felt in months. Not relief exactly. Something closer to the feeling of a weight being distributed. He had carried this alone for a long time. Now there were 3 of them, and he had made copies of everything. Copies that Calloway and Okafor now held. Copies that existed in physical form, in places that were not connected to any network and not accessible to anyone who came looking through official channels. He was sick by then. He had known for a while. The illness was not dramatic. It was quiet and steady, the way serious things often are, and it was moving faster than he had initially been told to expect. He had, his doctors suggested, somewhere between several months and a year. He used that time the way he had used every other resource in his career, methodically, with purpose. He compiled the full record, everything he had, into a single organized document with a clear index and precise source citations. He recorded himself walking through it on audio, his voice steady and unhurried, the same voice he had used in 30 years of field reports. And he gave Calloway and Okafor each a complete copy, in person, with the same careful instructions about where to keep it and under what circumstances to use it. He died in his house, in the room with the window he refused to close, with the sound of wind moving through the gap and the smell of old wood in the air. And within 6 months of his death, the people who came looking for the recordings moved through his effects with a speed and a thoroughness that told Calloway and Okafor everything they needed to know about how seriously those recordings were being taken. Both of them, independently, made the same decision. They moved their copies, said nothing publicly, and waited, watching to see what would happen next. What happened next was nothing, and that nothing was its own kind of answer. Here is what this story actually is, underneath all the documents and the frozen ground and the names of men who died carrying things they could not put down. It is a story about the difference between information and knowledge. Information is what gets filed and archived and reclassified and managed. Knowledge is what happens when a careful person refuses to let information stay in its box. Mercer did not discover anything that was not already discoverable. The maps were in the archives, the peer-reviewed research was in the journals, the acoustic data was in the equipment. Everything he found had been findable by anyone with the access and the patience to look. What he did was refuse to look away. And that refusal, that single, consistent choice, made over and over across years of opposition and silence and institutional pressure, is the only reason the picture exists at all. The picture of what is down there, under the ice, in the dark, in spaces that have been sealed from the surface world longer than any civilization we officially acknowledge has existed. The recording that 2 careful people are holding somewhere right now contains the full version of that picture. The one Mercer built across 30 years of fieldwork and months of obsessive archive research and a final clear-eyed understanding of what he had spent his career accidentally orbiting. It has not been officially released. The institutions that would want it have not found it, and the people holding it have made no public move. Yet. So here's the question I want you to sit with. If you found out tomorrow that the official history of human civilization on this planet had a deliberate gap in it, a gap that the people maintaining it had known about for generations and had actively chosen to preserve, would you want to know what was in that gap? Or would you rather the window stay closed and the room stay warm and the thing under the ice stay exactly where it is? Think about that carefully before you answer, because the answer says something about you that no institution can classify. If this story made you feel something real, leave a comment with your answer. It genuinely matters. And if you want to follow where this goes next, subscribe and leave a like. It is the only way to make sure you do not miss what comes after this.